Hello and welcome to this tutorial. Before we start, a quick recap of what we have so far. We have a class with a main method that is calling a setter on a circle object, and it's setting a name value. Now the circle object has a setter method, and we have written an aspect which has an advice method that will run before that setter method runs. The way I have configured it is I have used a before annotation, and the point cut expression that I've used is all methods that take in an argument as a string, the string being defined by the name over here and the name tied to a string value over here. So what's going to happen is when the setter of the circle is called, this advice is going to run before that. So let's run this class. Here you can see the setter has actually triggered this advice. Well, we don't know, we cannot see if it's run before because, the setter is not doing anything that's visible. So let me print out a simple statement over here. I'll just say circles setter has been called. Now if I run this, here you can see that the advice method runs, and then after that the setter method has been called. So the advice gets executed before the setter. A couple of things to note here. You can see that the setter is actually called twice. There is one output over here, and then there's one over here. The reason it's executed twice is the first time the setter is called is actually the Spring container doing its initialization. If you open the Spring XML, here you can see that the circle bean has been defined and a property name has been initialized. So this is actually calling the setter once, and this is happening during the initialization of the bean. And then after that, this is the second call to the setter. Okay, so the second thing to note here is the advice gets executed only for the call that we make in the program. It does not get executed for the call that the Spring container makes in order to initialize its member variables and dependencies. So this is an important point to note. So having said these, now let's have a look at this. So this advice is executing before the target method is being executed, and that's because I have a add before annotation configured over here. Now what if I want an advice method to get executed after the target method runs? Well, it's very simple. Just like we have add before, we also have a add after annotation, and annotating an advice method with add after will make this method run after the target method. So a before is actually one of the different advice types that's provided in Spring AOP. So we're going to look at a few more advice types after being one of them. So let's first change this to add after. Now this add after is, again, I've actually imported this earlier. So here you can see add after is again from AspectJ Lang annotation package, and this is all that we need to do in order to make this advice run after this setter. So let's test this out. Well, here you can see this is the first initialization by the Spring container. This is our call to the setter, and then after that the advice method is executed. And as far as the usage is concerned, the add after is very similar to the add before. So all the things that we've learned earlier, be it declaration of point cut expressions and using the names, or writing an inline point cut expression here, everything is valid even for an add after annotation. Now the thing about the add after is it executes after the method has run, no matter whether the method completed successfully or not. So this add after is executing after the setter. So if the setter completes successfully, or there is some problem in the execution of the setter and then there is an exception thrown, no matter what happens, this add after is going to trigger the execution after that setter. Now let's say you want a little bit more control over here. Let's say you want an advice to run only when the method completes successfully without throwing any exceptions or anything like that. So there is a separate annotation for that. What we can do is we can say at after returning. So an add after returning is again another type of advice in Spring AOP, and I import this from the same package. Now what happens is this annotation will mark this advice to run only if the target method executes successfully and returns. If there is any exception in the during the execution of this method, the advice will not get executed. So now if I run this, you won't notice anything different because the setter is called, the setter returns successfully, and then after that the advice is executed because right now the setter is returning. So, and after returning executes fine. Now in order to test out what happens in the case of an exception, I will now write throw statement that throws let's say a runtime exception. Okay, so now this setter will throw an exception. It's not going to return. So since I have thrown an exception in the setter, what I will now do is I will remove this initialization. I don't want Spring to get an exception when it's trying to initialize the beans. Okay, so this exception is now going to get thrown only when I make a call to the setter. So there's going to be only one call to the setter, and that call is going to return an exception. So now, since I've thrown an exception here, this should not get executed since this has been marked as an after returning. It should run only when the method returns. It should not run when an exception is thrown. Now let's run this. The setter has been called, and since I don't have any catch, it's actually printing out the stack trace over here. It says it's a runtime exception and the advice is not executed. So now what if I want an advice method to get executed on an exception? It's very simple. Let's go to the aspect. So here what I'll do is I'll write a new advice method. I'll call this the add after throwing. So add after throwing is another advice type in Spring AOP which makes the advice to get executed if an exception is thrown in the target method. So I will use the same point get expression over here. This is for args of name, and I'll write a new advice method over here. Public void call this exception advice. An exception has been thrown. Now after throwing, again an import from the same package, and we are all set. So now if I execute this, the setter is going to throw an exception, and then because of this exception, this advice will not run, but this advice should run. So let's run. So you see the stack trace again, but then here you can see that the advice has executed. So those are the three after advices. We have the after returning, we have the after throwing, and then we have an after which gets executed whether the method returns or it throws an exception. So the add after is commonly called as the after finally, because it acts like a finally block of your try catch. So no matter whether the execution completes successfully or there is an exception, that gets executed no matter what. So these are the three after advice types that are very handy. So one other thing we need to learn here is, just like we can capture the input arguments in our method. So here we caught the input string argument that was being passed to our target method, and we were able to use that inside our advice method. The same way, we might like to use the return object of the target method in the after returning, and the exception object of the target method in the after throwing, because an after returning is going to get executed when the method returns. Now what if you want the object that is getting returned by the target method not to actually modify it? We cannot take that return object and return something else to the actual caller, but we can actually examine it, and you can do things using the value, using the handle that is provided for the return object. So let's look at the return object now. So here I have an after returning. So this on returning is going to get it's going to trigger the advice. Now this does not return anything, so let's change this and let's create a new method that actually returns a string. So I'm going to call a new method over here, set name and return. It's going to return the string itself. It's not going to throw an exception here. Instead, it's going to return the value that it has actually got. It's kind of a contrived example here, but just the reason I'm doing this is so that I can have a method that returns some object, and I can get a handle to that returned object in my advice. So this is just a method that takes in a string and then kind of returns the same string. So this is a method that I've defined in the circle class. So now this after returning is going to apply to that method as well, because it takes an argument as a string. So it executes even when this method returns or if this method returns, but now we're going to execute this method to get a return object. So this is the set name and return, which is what we will execute here. So on execution of this, since it's returning an object, this should get executed. It's not throwing an exception, so this advice should get executed. Let's test this out once. So here you see that method is called, and then the advice gets executed after that. So now, what if I need a handle to the actual object, the actual string that is getting returned? Now, the way to do that is to change the parameters to this after returning. So what I do here is I write point cut equals okay. So earlier we had just given the point cut expression. So now what I'm doing is I'm putting a property here saying point cut equals the point cut expression. This is same as what we had earlier, no change here. But the reason why I'm doing this is so that I can add one more property here called returning. I can call it whatever I want. The only condition is whatever value I give here should be one of the arguments to my advice. So I will have a string argument which has the same name as what I've given over here. So again, just like the input argument, what I'm doing here is I'm giving a clue to Spring that I am interested in the return object of the target method. So I have given it a name and I have given it a type. So what this does is it tells Spring that this advice is to be executed for methods that have an input as a string given as this name here and the string here, and it has an output type also as a string, which is configured by this value here and then this value tied to a string here. So again, we are doing two things here. One is we are telling Spring what the input type and the output type is, and we are also having these values as arguments for our advice so that we can use those values in our advice method if required. So let's do just that. We can say that the method that takes in a string argument has been called, the value is this, and the output value is return string. So now what should happen is Spring is going to automatically substitute the return value over here. This return value will get substituted over here, and it's going to call this advice by passing these as arguments to this advice. So let's run and see that in action. So here you can see the advice has been called and both the values have been passed on to the advice. So I can use both the input arguments as well as the output value in my advice. And of course, you don't have to do both. You can do either. Say you do not want the input handler. Of course, since you have defined it over here, you need to have a method argument to your advice. But say you have a different point cut expression, something like this, and you're not really worried about the input argument that's passed. You just have to enter the point cut expression over here, and then just specify the returning property over here, and then you mention this property in your advice argument, then you can use this. Now, of course, here I've used a string, so I'm telling Spring that only if the return type is a string, you have to execute this after returning and, of course, capture the value. Now, if I want this advice to run for all all the return types, all I need to do is I need to give this as an object. Now, if I give this as an object, this kind of catches all return types. So no matter what the return type is, say I have another method that returns, let's say, a list or anything else. So that will trigger the execution here since I'm catching an object here, and then that value is going to get passed as an object. I will of course have to cast it to use this inside my advice. So just like we are using this, just like we're using a returning to catch the return type, we can also catch the exception over here. So again, all I need to do is I need to go to the after throwing annotation, and of course an exception can be caught only in advice that is annotated with an after throwing. So all I need to do is again change this to a point cut property, and then I add a new property here called throwing. I'll say ex as the exception, and then of course I will have to use that exception as a member, as a argument of the advice. So I'll call this runtime exception ex, and now I can actually print out the exception here. We'll just print out the toString of this exception. So again, I'm telling Spring two things here. One, I'm telling I want this after throwing to catch all methods that match this point cut expression, and then they're throwing a runtime exception. How am I doing that? I'm doing that by mentioning this EXO value over here, and then this EX has been defined as a runtime exception. So it catches only runtime exceptions, and then this runtime exception value is actually passed as an argument to my advice. So let's run this. Well, of course, I will have to change this here. I'll have to call the method that actually triggers the exception, which is the set name. Okay, so an exception is thrown, and then here you can see the advice is run, and it has a handle to the runtime exception over here. So again, I can configure what exceptions are caught here. Now let's say I define this as an exception, then no matter what the exception is thrown in any of the target methods, this advice is going to get run, and then exception object is handed over to this advice. And of course I can have multiple methods that are annotated with after throwing, and they are having the same point cut expression. So this particular method over here can have multiple advice methods that are annotated with after throwing for this method, and then depending on the exception that is thrown, I can have different after throwing methods that get executed depending on this exception value over here.